The clear sky of a summer day never bodes ill. The road led to a large abandoned building. There were 2 wheelbarrows parked near one of the building's entrances. In one of the rooms sit 2 beaten men. "I'm sorry to hear that, Professor," says the younger guy. "Don't say that, Major Kong." The professor spoke of how sorry he was for putting everyone in this situation. And this rescue mission would have been a success if the damn informant. He gave away their actions to a highly trained soldier. The professor with hatred continued to say that the informer worked for the opponents and they knew all the subtleties of the operation from the very beginning. That's why the intelligence gave them wrong information even about the number of opponents. This whole thing was a trap for all of us. After these words, both of them started shaking with anger and powerlessness. Someone unlocked the armor door. And with a strong kick of his leg, he threw another beaten guy in with the 2 of them. He was tied up and slumped to the floor with no strength. He clenched his teeth hard from the pain. He was beaten without restraint. Major Kong recognized that it was Sergeant Kim. He looked excitedly at his ward. Kong jumped up from his seat and yelled at the masked man, "You freak!" I heard something in a language I didn't understand. Were these soldiers from another country? The freak's words were followed by action. He hit Kanga's neck with the butt of his automatic rifle with all his might. From such a blow, Kong fell to his knees with his head on the floor and the soldier only smiled. The major grunted in pain and glared angrily at the enemy soldier. Thoth closed the heavy door behind him, leaving the 3 of them alone. Major Kong mentally swore, "This bastard is playing us like pawns." Kong was approached by Sergeant Kim and asked if he was okay. Kong only asked, "How are the others?" The sergeant said he didn't know because they'd been taken somewhere. These 2 heard something in the hallway and freaked out. Kong stared at the opening door. From there the enemy looked at him tiredly with a killer's stare. "What now?" asked the major, expecting the worst. Just as suddenly someone appeared behind the enemy and killed him with lightning speed. This unknown man said, "Are you Major Hamchon Kong?" This soldier spoke Korean. Kong asked the unknown man who he was. This fighter definitely just spoke Korean, which made the 3 hostages tense up. The masked man said that he had come for Kong and anyone with him could follow him. The masked man's face was tightly covered and only a lock of white hair and eyes were visible. And there they were in yours, running down the hallway as fast as they could. Kong, who was walking behind the fighter in the masked man, noticed that the soldiers in the corridor had already been killed. But they didn't hear anything. Could he have been trained to kill such trained soldiers so quickly? Kong then asked the fighter what division he was in and how many troops had arrived on the scene, but the fighter replied that he had arrived alone and would not say who he was working for. The major was amazed that this fighter alone could kill so many soldiers. And yet he was undetected. At that moment, one of the enemy soldiers looked out into the corridor. Kong along with Sergeant Kim tensed up. "It's one of them." In the room from which the soldier looked out there was another one and they were already preparing to attack. "He will give us away," thought Kong. Major Kong was afraid that they wouldn't walk past the 2 soldiers quietly. Kong pointed his gun at them and the fighter in the masked man at that moment jumped towards the soldiers. He knocked one man's gun away with his bare hands. Next was a swipe to the apple of his eye. It was so hard it felt like the air had been cut. After such a blow, the enemy soldier fell down without being able to breathe. The one that was still in the room something yelled in an unknown language and clicked the bolt of his automatic rifle. The unidentified masked fighter took a swing. Something whistled through the air. That deadly something turned out to be a knife that stabbed straight into the enemy. The enemy soldier went dumbfounded and fell to the floor with a knife in his chest. The soldier was standing and at his feet were 2 corpses that had been alive a minute ago. Kong mentally marveled at how quickly the guy took out 2 soldiers without even drawing his gun and wondered where he served. The masked fighter only now pulled out a silenced pistol and said they all needed to hurry and preferably only use the weapon if absolutely necessary. And Kong realized that the guy meant for them to stay out of his way. There was no objection. Quiet shots through the silencer. All of the bullets hit the enemy soldiers aptly. The masked fighter runs swiftly to the front and fires another series of shots at the enemy. And just alive, he's already dying. Kong ran after the friendly fighter without lagging behind. The voices of a large number of enemies could be heard ahead and Kong prepared to help the fighter. He decided to help him with such a large enemy. That's where the silence should end. He cocked the bolt. But while Kong was thinking, the fighter was already quietly running towards the opponents. He didn't understand why he was so quick to rush at the enemy now. Don't you have to discuss and think things over? It was 3 enemy soldiers. They spoke loudly in their own language. A masked fighter ran out in front of them. He was fast. And pointed his gun at the three men in cold blood. He had a real killer look in his eyes. He took them all by surprise. They didn't even have time to react. How in the same second their bodies were pierced by bullets and their consciousness was burned by the pain of death. The guy in the mask changes the clip of the gun on the fly. He quickly slid the bullet receiver back into place. Kongu only had to watch the swift movements of this unknown fighter. He didn't even move before the guy took them all down. What a beast, thought Kong fluently as he watched the unknown helper was already far away from the soldiers he had killed. His tactics are too reckless for a normal military man, continued Kong mentally looking at how the guy moved quickly and silently. They've reached the exit, but they haven't gotten out yet. The masked fighter leaned against the side wall and looked out into the courtyard. He gestured for Kong to stop. We are waiting here 1 minute. Why? Asked Kong. And only then did he realize. He was too surprised by the fighter's skills and had forgotten something. Or rather, someone Sergeant Khan and the professor he was dragging on his back, out of breath. He was mentally dissatisfied with himself for not taking into account their weak condition though. Should have, no matter what the circumstances. He looked at the friendly fighter and realized this guy had read everything. Through the eye cutout, Kong turned his attention to the fighter's black eyes. Also, this fighter speaks good but not perfect Korean, Kong recalled. Are you Korean? Major Kong asked directly. Did I guess? Kong asked himself mentally. The masked fighter ignored the question and said it was time to move on. And now they're all running down the field. Kong kept close to his weakened comrades as suddenly they stopped. They saw their men. They were alive and waiting for them by the car. How did you all get here? Kong asked. They were elsewhere while these three were being held here. The attendant pointed at the unknown fighter and said that he was the one who pulled them out, then asked them to wait here and returned with Kong and the others. The fighter just turned to them and told them to move southwest and they would be expected there. Major Kong thanked the unknown fighter and he replied that he was just running an errand. And Kong finally realized that the man who had saved him and his men was a mercenary. And Kong held out his hand smiling at him. Even if it's just a job for you, I still want to show my gratitude. Whatever the reason, you saved me and my men, Kong said smiling at the fighter. The masked fighter looked into Tsangu's eyes with his black eyes. And he thought for a moment. He was about to reach out his hand to Kong when he suddenly felt something. It was a strong vibration of the earth. There was a volley. The masked guy froze for a moment. Things hadn't gone according to plan. What's that sound? The frightened major thought mentally. The masked fighter yelled, "All, get down." Kang's men didn't even have time to realize anything. It was a massive explosion. A deafening blast to the point of ringing in my ears. Kong shivered violently. He covered his ears with his hands and blood ran down his forehead. Kong realized it was a mortar. Because of the explosion, the major heard nothing. Kong also thought about how the professor and his men were doing. They crouched above the ground in a cloud of smoke. He looked at them and realized that everyone was in one piece. That was a good thing. The bloodied major began to hear through the ringing in his ears the gunshots. The graphics that shot at them were already under the masked fighter's fly. Kong stared in surprise in front of him. He saw the fighter. The explosion and the commotion made his handkerchief that covered his face come undone. He shot at the enemy and still managed on his own. The blonde guy was also bloody around the forehead. And the blood had managed to stain his face. Major Kong sat and watched. His face was contorted with surprise and horror. The soldier who saved him and his men was a child. 6 months later, the warm sun was still shining. A quiet school day. The teacher asked the students to raise their eyes and look. The girls immediately blushed. It was a handsome man. The insecure bully mentally. Swearing at a kid I didn't know. And some just watched quietly like a mouse. The teacher spoke in a pleasant voice about a new student joining them today. A tall, white-haired boy. The guy greeted everyone. My name is Ejinu. He looked at the class with his black eyes. Another day of quiet school life. A warm day of early summer. Someone's tapping a pen on a notebook out of boredom. The girl thought about the fact that the guy she knew must be in homeroom by now. Just as suddenly, another girl came running into the classroom and was filing everyone in. She ran up to her girlfriends and started squealing with delight, saying that she had just seen an incredible handsome boy who had transferred to them today and was in his 3rd year. The girl mentally scrolled through, student transferred to 3rd year. Maybe a classmate saw my brother? With a smile on her face, the girl thought. The girl looked a little embarrassed. My brother? The girl remembered how she believed he died in a car accident with her parents. I didn't realize he'd be back in 10 years. Thought the girl, remembering the plane at the airport. The airport building. She's here to pick up her brother. Surprised, she stares at him from far away, frozen in place. He stands there with a blank stare, crying, while someone holds his face with 2 trembling hands. It's you, you're alive. You've been alive all these years. Intermittently said the crying grandfather, holding his adult grandson's hands over his face. And the girl stood back. Is that my brother? She asked herself in her mind. A grown-up handsome boy looked at her from over his grandfather's shoulder. The girl shivered at that direct look. He thought for a moment what to do. And I decided to smile at her. As sincerely as he could. There was a voice saying, "Are you Dion? Wake up, Dion." The girl woke up excitedly. "Stupid bitch, do you have any idea how many times I screamed your name?" shouted the arrogant girl, and Dion apologized on automatic. The bitchy blonde along with her ugly friend stood over Dion, and the former said, "Give me your gym uniform, you brought it, didn't you?" Dion nervously said, "Yes, but what do I wear if I give it to you?" The bitch glared at her. "What did you just say?" All the girls in the class turned around nervously, and the blonde yelled, "Don't talk to me, bitch." The asshole smacked Dion on the head and added, "That's your fucking problem, not mine." She asked Dion, "I've been too nice to you, haven't I?" The girls in the class turned away just as nervously. And the blonde asked the girl what would happen if she beat her in front of everyone that would put her in her place. Dion was frightened into silence. 3rd year, 2nd grade. The teacher's pleasant voice repeated that a new student had joined them. It was Dion's brother, a tall blonde man with black hair. The teacher also said that the newcomer had been living abroad for a long time and she would count on the students to help him get better adjusted here. The girls in the class were similarly glowing red cheeks with excitement. The class bully still stares at him unhappily. Well, the quiet one was looking at the next pretty boy in class. The teacher told Eugene to sit in the empty seat at the back of the desk, and the boy politely agreed. And quietly began to pace. He was walking, and someone in a sports uniform was looking at him unhappily. This patched something in a tracksuit mentally resented the girl's reaction to the new guy's appearance. "He just looks like a girl." The bully in class called out the name, Jihan. He turned to this boy in gym shoes. And Jichen grinned at Eugene, intending to do something funny by his standards. He tripped Ijan. "Let's see how you handle this." Ejin just stopped at the footboard. Jichen watched his plan go awry. Ijan was looking at this stupid prank as well. Jichen is pissed because he timed it perfectly and the new guy is still looking right at him. He was angry that Eugene was completely calm now, looking at him without averting her gaze. "Bitch, you got some kind of problem," read Eugene in Jichen's eyes. And he remembered Major Kong telling him to stay away from fights when he returned to Korea. Eugene remembered how he said he understood it and how worried Kong was. Ijan then told Kong that he doesn't go into battle without knowing enough about the situation. And how he added that rash decisions could affect his life and that it would be a rookie mistake. This then threw Kong into a state of confusion. Eugene bluntly told Major Kong that he had been to many battlefields in the past 10 years and it had made him a professional. Major Kong gestured for Eugene to stop. And asked him to listen to what he had to say. After all, Kong was saying all this for the sake of the poor kid who'd be up against Ijan. And the guy in the sweatpants interrupted the memories with, "What are you looking at? You want to die?" Ijan stood silent and didn't move. And the teacher asked the new kid if everything was okay. Ijan politely apologized to her and told her it was okay. He silently walked past the bully who sat at the desk. Jichen grinned and called Eugene a loser. Ijan walked on in silence. And the one who started it all sat there sighing unhappily. The teacher asked Youngchan to help the newcomer prepare for class since they would be sitting together, and he naturally agreed. The bell rang and the teacher said goodbye and wished everyone a good class. Youngchan smiled sweetly and introduced himself to the newcomer. And asked if he heard his name correctly. "Eugene, right?" And Eugene politely confirmed. Suddenly, Youngchan squinted his eyes and became nervous. And he whispered to Eugene, "I hope you're not too worried about what Jigen wanted to do." Youngchan also told Eugene that he should pay attention to the 2 individuals in this class. This is Jihyun and the person sitting behind him is Hyujinju. These 2 were just discussing Hyujin's new cell phone. Youngchan also told Ijan that the first lesson would be math. The newcomer looked at the 2 of them carefully. Eugene smiled politely and thanked Youngchan. Yongchang also smiled and thought, he seems to be good, what a relief. Math class had begun and the elderly teacher was telling the students to not shy to ask questions because he wants to teach them his subject well. The teacher said to open the textbooks to page 47. And started writing the equation on the board. The students for the most part tried to learn but not all of them. Istin stared intently at the board. While someone was still asleep. Then he glanced discreetly to the side. He looked at young Chan who was diligently writing everything down. Afterward, he looked the other way. He stared at Jichen's back. Someone in the class was discussing the news, a normal school. Ejin decided to check the situation outside the window. Outside, other students were playing with soccer balls. He looked at the carefree children. And I remembered myself in the 10 years that he spent without knowing childhood. How he killed and fought. How he got wounded and cried in pain and regret. Like walking up to my neck in a swamp with no way to wash. How I practiced until I was exhausted because there was no other way. How he learned to shoot different weapons and always hit the target. He was a murderer and an instrument of death by fiat. And he learned to be cold-blooded by killing the child inside him. He closed his eyes. And then he opened with relief. And looking at the clear sky outside the window, I mentally said to myself, it's so peaceful in here. Evening was coming. All the students were leaving the school premises and saw something. Dion excitedly stopped in the crowd. Standing at the exit of the school grounds was her. Ijin's brother was waiting for her. She asked excitedly, are you waiting for me? And Eugene said he wanted to go home with her unless she had other plans. Dion began to look around confused and babbled that she didn't have any other plans. Eugene smiled sweetly at her, then let's go home together. She calmed down and gave a slightly embarrassed okay look. The evening was coloring the sky more and more. Ijin walked in silence looking forward. Dion was also silent but searching for something to say. Ejin suddenly said, awkward, huh? And Dion suddenly got very excited and started to say in a hurry that it wasn't like that, it wasn't awkward at all. Ejin smiled calmly and said that there was nothing strange about it because he was also embarrassed. Dakin looked at him and he continued to say that he was only 9 years old at the time of the accident and that he didn't remember anything about himself or his grandfather. He turned to Dion, this must be even weirder for you, since you were only 7 years old. Now they were walking in silence again. Suddenly, Dakin heard a familiar voice say, when is Hoojin coming? It was her classmate, the girlfriend of the girl who'd been bullying Dahan, who was sitting with the guys in the pebble who couldn't wait for the blonde. Suddenly that girl looked up at Dahini, is that you? Dakin was very frightened and froze, what do I do? The girl thought frantically. One of the guys asked who she was and the classmate grinned and said, the girl Hoojin hates. And immediately asked who Dion was going home with. And added, I didn't think people like you could be in a relationship. Ejin looked at the three of them. Dion started nervously excusing herself and said it was her brother and that girl was really surprised that the girl had a brother. Eugene politely asked if they were her friends and Dion said yes, friends from class. The curly-haired girl immediately lost her temper, God damn it, bitch, you called me your friend? Dion began to shake with fear and the classmate continued to press on non-verbally, did you seriously just say I was your friend? Ijin glared at the cunt but continued to remain silent while his sister tried to justify herself. One of the guys was pissed off that Ijin was looking right at them. Dion was starting to worry about him, too. Watch yourself before you get beaten up, snarled the bully haughtily. Damn freak, he's still looking at us, is the second one to start coming out of the herself while the schoolgirl sat there smiling. Ijin looked at them with his black eyes. He was trying to figure out if these two really wanted to start a fight and at that time one of them stood up and said he wasn't going to stand for it. Ijin hand pushing his sister back while the bully was going at him with the mats. The freak walked up close and said, dumbass you want to play tough in front of your sis now? Ijin stared at him silently. Eugene realized that this fool was too open-like for someone trying to start a fight. And he's going to me without a second thought. Ejin's eyes poured red. He leaves all vital points open, thought Eugene looking at the fool. Ijin noticed that the bully doesn't even have a weapon, then why is he so reckless in not defending himself before a fight? And then Eugene remembered Major Kong telling him not to get into fights. Sighing heavily, Ijin thought, how about just leaving? But at that time the boys grabbed Ijin by the scruff of the neck and shouted swinging, answer me you little bitch. At that moment Dion intervened, excuse me please. Shouted the girl with her head bowed. She excuses Ijin to this asshole, my brother was abroad for a long time. Ijin looked at his sister silently as she continued, so he hasn't had time to get used to how things work in Korea yet. Classmate Dion grinned squeamishly at this whole spectacle. Dion trembled in a bow. So what? The bully yelled. This asshole totally lost his temper and yelled about how he doesn't care that bitch grew up overseas and shows no respect. Aijin looked at his sister and was confused. No one's ever stood up for him before. He saw her trembling with fear and didn't know what to do next. Aijin slapped the arm the freak was holding him with. The one cried out in pain and started swearing even more. Aijin threw his backpack on the ground and stepped forward. He walked over to Dion holding his jacket in his hands. The girl understood what was about to happen and was worried about her brother. He leaned toward her and with a gentle smile asked her to wait 1 minute. He gave her his jacket, and she gave him her jacket. Looking confused, he threw his jacket over her face so she wouldn't look and repeated, "Just 1 minute." Behind Eugene's back, the bully was still yelling and preparing to strike. Aijin quickly turned his attention back to the fight. He instantly stopped his attacker with an elbow strike to the stomach. And the asshole went to the ground spitting up blood. Aijin followed up with another quick and strong strike. Another guy had already gotten up from the table while Dion's nasty classmate looked on fearfully at how to fight. Aijin sighed heavily, "So I broke my promise to Major Kongu." Eugene stood to his full height and looked at those carefree children with his cold black eyes. The guy he hit was unconscious. The one that got up from the table froze in fear. Damn, what the hell is this? The evening sun illuminated the purple clouds. Soldiers in combat boots ran the distance. A platoon of young fighters jogged briskly to the score. They were trained by Major Kong. A ward ran up to Kong and addressed him. It was Sergeant Kim and he asked if today was Ejin's first day of school and the major said it was. Kim began to remember how they had been training him for half a year and said he was worried because the boy had lived in a harsh place since he was 9 years old. "I hope he takes it well coming home," said the sergeant. Kong only boasted that it was good to train him for life in Korea and Kim agreed with his superior. He had no doubts about Ejin. At this time, Ejin had just taken out the first guy with a single punch. And he fell spitting blood. But Ejin decided to strike again. Ejin had to break his promise to Major Kong, he protects his sister. Ejin stood resolute. Now he has a family that he will protect no matter what. The eyes of the guy on the ground rolled up, he was unconscious. Ejin was surprised that this kid was knocked unconscious by a single blow. And the two men in the background were terrified. Ejin shifted his gaze to the boy and his sister's trashy classmate. And he jumped toward them. The guy by the table was hoping to dodge Ejin's punch. But immediately got hit in the stomach with a fist as if by a projectile. From such a strong blow, he flew very far away. As he flew, his eyes rolled too and spittle sputtered. Ejin just watched standing still as the bully fell. The girl in Dion's class was scared shitless and couldn't even scream. Ejin stood there looking at her, making her even more scared. He looked at her like he was going to kill her here and now. She stared into his eyes and drooled nervously. Dion called out to Ejin. She looked at her brother wide-eyed. She saw two unconscious bodies and didn't understand how he'd done it, since Eugene had only covered her eyes with his jacket for a moment. Ejin's gaze shifted to his sister and the willingness to kill disappeared from him. The girl with curlers stood all blue with fear. Ejin silently walked around her and went to his sister. Ejin walked over to Dion and apologized. "I didn't scare you." The girl was surprised. Ejin immediately switched the subject. "Do you want a snack? Do you have any favorite dishes?" Dion said that he didn't scare her and everything was fine, and Eugene decided to ask her if that was the case. And Dion just calmly silently looked him in the eye. Ejin was uncomfortable and rubbed his neck. "Let's go home then." Dion agreed and gave him his jacket. Ejin looked at his sister, smiled at her and thanked her. The nasty classmate Dion was still standing like a stumbling block. She didn't understand how he'd changed his face so quickly, because he'd just been looking at her a minute ago and was literally ready to kill her. Dion looked at her classmate and she flinched. Dion hesitantly but loudly told her, "See you later." Ejin followed his sister and glanced at the girl. She stood as if with her brain shut off with no way of understanding what was happening. And then I racked my brain. The brother and sister walked on and Dion started a conversation. "You're the one who did those guys, aren't you?" she asked her brother. Ejin said it was him and Dion replied that she dropped everything. She looked at her brother and thought about how he didn't seem like the kind of guy who'd picking fights. She explained to her brother that in Korea it was not customary to look at people the way he did or it would lead to embarrassing situations. Ejin replied that where he'd been for so long, it wasn't customary either, and depending on the opponent, it could be dangerous too. Dion wondered, "Then why were you looking at those guys like that?" Ejin looked at his sister and didn't immediately find something to say. He remembered how afraid Dion was and how she had asked him not to touch him. And he said he only did it all because they caused her trouble. Dion was surprised that someone had stood up for her, since she'd had to endure all of this without protection before. She blushed and Eugene noticed it. Ijin was surprised at this reaction from his sister. It made him think he had said something wrong and they walked on without speaking. Night came and they were home. Grandpa excitedly asked Eugene to sit down and eat fruit with his sister while he washed the dishes. But Ijin put on a strawberry robe and with a smile on his face said he would do everything himself and let Grandpa rest. Grandpa got flustered but accepted what Eugene said. Ijin handled the dishes skillfully. The girl glanced in his direction from time to time expecting a request for help. Grandpa said tiredly that he hoped dinner wasn't too bad. He'd tried, but he'd never been much of a cook. Ijin replied that his grandfather should not say such things about himself, for he and his sister were eating well only because of him. Grandpa was embarrassed and said that if that was the case, it was a big relief. Dion eating apples next to her grandfather, she realized that he was too shy, but he seemed very happy that her brother liked the food he cooked for them. Grandpa even took a cooking class to prepare. In time for Ejin's arrival. Grandpa asked Dion if she enjoyed her dinner and she said it was great. Grandpa decided to ask Ejin how his first day of school went and if anything interesting happened. 362. Ijin immediately stopped grimacing at the dishes. He turned to his grandfather and wondered why. To start, Dion nervously nibbled on a piece of apple. Ejin turned back to the sink and said the day had gone well. Grandpa was very happy about this and smiled peacefully. Dion and Ijin said goodnight to Grandpa and he told them to sleep soundly. Eugene lay back in bed and sighed. He couldn't sleep and stared at the ceiling. He remembered his grandfather holding his face with his hands and crying with happiness that the boy had come home alive. He also remembered his grandfather reassuring him that everything was fine when he was told he couldn't remember much from his childhood. The important thing is that you're alive. As his grandfather smilingly removed him to a table full of different food and said he didn't know what he liked so he cooked everything he could and hoped it would be delicious. Ijin smiled at this memory. And quietly closed his eyes. Family, he found it again and he's not alone now. He began to dream of a noisy commotion. It was the sound of the passenger jet systems not working. The plane was shaking violently. People were in a panic. Systems threw out oxygen masks. The couple immediately gave an oxygen mask to the little boy. It was Ijin and his parents. The plane was going down, but the parents were trying to stay calm. They hugged the baby to protect his fragile body. And the boy suddenly realized that this was the end. His eyes filled with fear. There was no escape from the plane that was falling from a great height. Ijin woke up because of this intense fear. He rose abruptly from the bed in an attempt to realize where he was. He was home. The boy covered his face with his hands. It was a nightmare. He shuddered and once again mentally told himself that it was only a dream. Ijin, sitting up in bed, tried to regain his breath. It was only 7 and a bit in the morning. Eugene sat up in bed, recovering from the nightmare. He heard some noise outside the door. So I decided to see what was going on. He opened the door and stepped out of the room. It was his sister in the kitchen, cooking something for breakfast and glad that his brother was awake, because she was going to wake him up soon. Eugene asked where Grandpa was. Dion said Grandpa left for work at the crack of dawn and Ijin was surprised that Grandpa was working. Dion said that Grandpa had taken the day off to spend with Eugene when he arrived and now he had his first day of work. She also told her brother that it was time for her to go to school because her classes were starting soon. The girl asked her brother to remember to eat breakfast, since the food was already on the table. Eugene thanked her confusedly. And so Eugene was left home alone. He looked at the kitchen table. There were many delicious and flavorful dishes on it again. Sister cooked everything herself. It's time to head off to school. The school corridor is always the noisiest place. The blonde bitch was standing there looking out the window. So the student who transferred in yesterday is her brother? And the girl with the curlers who witnessed his power yesterday said it was. She looked down at the floor and looked nervous. She remembered how the boys had taken a long time to recover after he'd dealt with them and how worried she'd been about them. She didn't understand how he was able to knock those two out with one punch. The guys were pissed. When those two woke up, a blonde came in and asked what had happened. She stood and rudely repeated, "I said, what's going on here?" And the girl with the beagles thought, "Why don't you stop bugging Dion?" She remembered how the look on Eugene's face had scared the hell out of her. Dion has a protector now. Her hands started to shake at the memory of that guy's stare. And she tried to reassure herself that everything would be okay following her evil friend. After all, Brother Eugene and his gang basically run the school. The stairs of the school hallway are not empty. Someone threw something at Dion's head. She turned around fearfully. It was Eugene, who told her not to react and swore at her. Her curly-haired friend was quiet and was no longer happy with her friend's actions. Dion asked what she wanted and Hoojin told her to follow her. Dion asked, "Where to?" Hoojin lost her temper. "Sorry, do you really think having a brother changes anything?" Dion was nervous but tried to hold on. "Just shut your mouth and follow me. Unless you want me to kick your ass right here," Hoojin said, looking up at Dion. They went to the stadium. Hoojin kicked with all her might. Dion fell to the ground near the trash bags from the impact. "Didn't I tell you to keep your head down?" Hoojin asked with a shout. Dion didn't know what she was talking about. Hoojin told her not to play dumb and they would now talk about yesterday. "Seems your brother thinks he's a badass astron just today. You're gonna have a bad day." "A very bad day," the bitch said, looking at her phone. "Your brother also has a very wonderful welcome at school," said Hoojin angrily looking at Dion. "What does that mean?" Dion asked fearfully. Hoojin told Dion that her brother had beaten up her brother's friends yesterday. She smiled bloodthirstily at the frightened girl. Also pretending to be cute, she said that right now they were going to meet Eugene. Dion was very frightened. Suddenly, the girl shouted angrily, "What are you going to do to my brother?" Hoojin immediately slapped her face and ordered her to shut her mouth. She slapped Dion's face hard. Dion was confused to be hit so hard in the face. She clenched her teeth and worried that her brother was really in trouble right now. Dion began to cry with fear and worry for her brother, but also with hatred for Hoojin, her brother and his gang. "It's all because of me," ran the thought in the poor girl's mind. Suddenly, Dion jumped up, much to Hoojin's surprise. And she ran to her brother, and Hoojin yelled at her in a swear word so she wouldn't run away from her. Third year, second grade. Gawkers were already gathering in and around the office. The students were frightened by the atmosphere in the room. Jichin and Hyujin stood angrily looking at Ijin and made the situation very tense. Those that the new guy beat up yesterday and a gang of their friends started coming into the office. Ijin just calmly watched this whole spectacle of awesomeness. The guys who were beaten yesterday were very angry about being embarrassed by the defeat yesterday. Also, some smug red-headed kid walked into the classroom. At that moment, Dion just ran into the classroom and called out to her brother by name, Ijin. Her breathing was ragged as she tried to run as fast as possible to his classroom. Ijin saw that she was beaten. He looked at his sister worriedly. "Dion?" His eyes went wide at the sight of her. There was a red mark on her cheek from the blow. And there was a muddy footprint on his clothes in the stomach area from being kicked with a shoe. Someone said mockingly, "Wow, a sister's so worried about her brother, that's something." It was that smug red-haired guy who was Hoojin's brother, and he started complaining about her jokingly. "Mine just whines and nags me to do stuff for her." At that time his sister came up too. She said she'll worry about him when someone kicks his ass. Ijin watched this whole circus in silence and was only worried about the battered one, a sister. He saw only her frightened and battered face with tired eyes. It was like all the people had disappeared and it was just the two of them standing there looking into each other's eyes. The office of the second class of the third year. It was recess and all the students were minding their own business. Someone threw chalk at someone. Youngchan stared at the floor and trembled with fear. Everyone kept throwing chalk at him. It was the two artists Jichin and Hyujin. They were having fun because Jichin had hit Youngchan in the head. Hyujin walked over to another classmate and told him to hand over the eraser. The kid had no choice. He handed over the eraser or they'd turn their attention to him. Hyujin prepared to throw. He swung hard and threw the eraser right at Youngchan's temple, who cried out in pain. The two men were so pleased with themselves for bullying the weak that even the wreath on Hyujin's forehead swelled. They were discussing his marksmanship and throwing power. They stood around laughing about how cool it is to hurt a classmate who can't even respond. Jichin held up a large piece of chalk and here's an M4 carbine. He swung around to fully repress his disgusting soul. And he would have gotten in if someone hadn't stood against Inchan, turning blue with fear. The two were disappointed and surprised that someone interrupted them. And a piece of chalk fell right next to Eugene's foot. He walked silently to his chair and was about to sit down. Jinan said in a voice, "That bastard's starting to get on my nerves." And Hyujin smilingly said that they would definitely talk to him today after school. Jichin was overjoyed at this news. Yenchan nervously turned to Ijin. Ijin only asked if Youngchan was okay. And he answered frightened that he was fine, because those two were looking at them. They knew he wouldn't say anything and smirked, and Youngchan was even more scared. Ijin saw all this and was not happy with the state of affairs. Youngchan advanced to Ijin and asked what he was doing after school today. Youngchan offered to show the school grounds to Ijin if he didn't have any more plans. Eugene said he wouldn't be able to make it tonight because he was going home with his sister. Young-chan's face lit up. You have a sister? Did you transfer with her? Ijin said she was a student here before he transferred. Young-chan asked her what her name was and Ijin said, Dae-young-yu. Young-chan visibly tensed up. Dae-young-yu from freshman year is your sister? Young-chan asked worriedly and Ijin wondered if he knew her if he was reacting like that. Yen-chan searched for something to say and it seems Ijin was beginning to guess what the matter was. Young-chan said that Dae-young is having a hard time at school right now. Ijin didn't understand what Young-chan meant. Young-chan fell silent again and became very tense. It was clear what he meant. And then he started saying that Dae-young was famous back in middle school because she was smart and pretty and a lot of boys liked her. Because of that, one girl started jealous and proceeded to abuse Dae-young. Ijin asked in surprise, she bullied her and everyone just let it happen. Young-chan began to tremble and said that that girl's brother, Gushu Kim, was the scariest bandit in this school. Ijin once again asked his name, Goose Kim? Young-chan very seriously though cautiously spoke further. And it's gotten even worse in high school Dae-young because they're in the same school. It's so bad that everyone's surprised she's still in school. So, this girl just liked a boy who happened to like Dae-young? And that's the only reason she's being bullied? Disappointedly, Eugene clarified. In-chan lowered his eyes and said that everything always starts with a stupid reason. People like that don't need a good reason to pick on anyone. Even that big piece of chalk says so. Eugene remembered his grandfather slicing apples and talking about school starting soon. Grandpa hoped that the adjustment to school would go smoothly and Ijin asked not to worry. Grandpa was worried since Ijin had been abroad for more time and asked Dae-young, "You're doing well in school, right?" And Dae-young, as it turned out, lied to Grandpa smiling, "Of course, Grandpa, you know I'm doing great in school. That's why I never had to worry about you, Dae-young." She was such a good student and her teachers had nothing but good things to say about her. Only good things are said about her, Ijin. Grandfather was so happy with this lie. Ijin was happy about it at that point, too. Even then, he noticed Dae-young's face change. And Eugene now realized why her face had changed so much. Young-chan asked Ijin if he was okay and he only thanked him for telling him everything. "Everyone here knows about it anyway, but I hope you're not too worried about it." Young-chan sighed in relief. But Eugene was only seemingly calm. And so the one who first fell unconscious from a single blow from Ijin yesterday burst into the classroom. Everyone was naturally frightened, but they kept quiet as usual. All the gang of juvenile delinquents came into the classroom. Jin asked them what they were doing here. And Goose, the bitch's brother, told him he was here to talk about his business. He was smirking. Hyujin and Jihyun tensed up. The blonde thought he could handle the others, but he couldn't handle Goose Kim. The second troublemaker from yesterday pointed to Ejin, "That's him." Ijin sat calmly in his seat. Goose started to tell off these two. "Did you get your ass kicked by that skinny bitch?" The guys started making excuses. "He took us by surprise." "Fucking retards and your lame excuses," Gus said impatiently and with anger. He said hello to Ejin and the latter looked in his direction. "Yeah bitch, come here," said Goose smugly, beckoning with his finger. Ijin silently stood up from where Young-chan had fallen out. Jishing and Hyujin looked at Ejin in silence. They didn't know what he had done to Goose Kim, but now he was dead. Ejin stood and said, "So you're Goose Kim, huh? Didn't think you'd have time to find out who I was." The ghoul smirked. Ijin just stared silently into his eyes. He turned to his subordinates, and that he would just look at me like that, deal with him. The one who was beaten yesterday became visibly agitated, but stepped forward toward Eugene. Just at that moment, Dae-young ran into the classroom. Eugene saw his frightened and battered sister. He was surprised by her appearance but more so by her looks. She was breathing hard and her cheek bore the mark of the blow. There was a footprint on his abdomen from being kicked with a shoe. Ejin became angry. Gusu Ekidnosti increased that the sister came running to help her brother, "It's so small." And the comedian started complaining about his sister who was just passing by. And she coldly said she'd feel sorry for him when someone kicked his ass. "Damn bitch, you made me run through half the school. Damn, you're fast." Hyujin marched up to Dae-young. Dae-young was scared and angry. But most of all she was worried about her brother. Goose Kim stood in front of his gang and grinned evilly as if he was about to have some fun like he was used to. Ijin looked only at his battered sister. Dae-young looked at him and started to cry. "I'm sorry Ijin for getting you into this," she squeezed out. Hyujin stood and sighed in disgust. "Damn drama queen." Eugene turned to his sister. "Dae-young, you have nothing to regret. Dion cried and looked at her brother. And he immediately hit the guy who flew so far away from him yesterday. And the next time, he hit him faster and harder. Just like yesterday, the freak fell to the floor. The guy who passed out first yesterday started shaking, and the guy who didn't see everything yesterday was in shock. After the blow, Aijina turned to her sister again. They're the ones who should apologize, not you. He's already got the first guy who went, "You little piece of shit," on him. Aijin had no problem dodging his crooked punch. And the freak's neck was exposed. Aijin punched him right in the caddy with a lightning-fast punch. The freak lost the ability to breathe and close his mouth. A terrible pain clouded his eyes. He fell to his knees and held his throat, making hoarse noises. Ijin moved without delay towards the next freak from Gus Kim's gang, and that youngster was not remotely scared. Gua still decided to attack Ijin first. Naturally, he didn't hit Aijin and opened his arm for a direct hit, which the guy took advantage of. From such a blow, the unfortunate man flew away to another corner of the classroom. Guzyu Kim stood like a stumbling block. No one had ever managed his guys like that before. He stood there not understanding what had happened. Why his boys were already unconscious on the floor. And Ejin was standing in front of him like nothing had happened. Jichin and Hyujin were also shocked at how quickly he had dealt with the three opponents. Hyujin was already worried about her brother, and her scary friend was scared shitless again. Dion looked at her brother without tears. She couldn't believe that he was. But I was very happy about it. Ijin was still standing calmly in front of the previously smug gang leader Gushu Kim. "I heard that my sister is having a hard time thanks to you," said Ijin rudely and loudly, looking at Goose and his sister with eyes full of hatred and determination. These two are scared for what seems like the first time in a long time they've been threatened by someone. The students in the classroom were still just as frightened and habitually silent. Gusu pulled himself together and began to speak. He was still playing it cool and wanted to find out what kind of person Ijin was. He should have learned about the enemy beforehand. Ijin just stared at him in silence. Gushu couldn't stand it and rushed towards Ijin with mats. He swung his foot and wanted an answer to his question from Egan. He cheered as he thought that would be enough. Gusu was already confident that this punch would knock Ijin out. Suddenly he saw that Ejin was looking at him. Ejin had regrouped nicely to block the fucker's blow, and looked him straight in the eye without fear or regret. He saw that Ijin was already ready to block his right jab, and Gusu decided to hit with a left. He regrouped dramatically. But Ijin blocked this unexpected blow with just one hand. Afterward, he grabbed Guzia's leg with his arm around his knee. And the devil went flying with a squeal. Ijin dragged him to meet his fist, which came right into the freak's pompous face. Gusu fell to the floor and blood spurted from his nose. He covered his face with his hand and swore. The poor guy seemed angry. He looked at Egan with frantic and intense eyes. Ijin stood over him and silently stared back right into the eyes of the freak, who thought he was strong. Suddenly, Ijin's gaze changed from cold to angry. He was ready to kill again. Gushu saw this determination and was frightened. At that very second, Ijin kicked Goose right in the face with all his hatred. Gusu was passed out and his blood splattered on the floor. Ijin stared at the work of his hands. And then raised his eyes toward his sister and the freak's sister. The entire class was shocked by Ijin's skills and fighting skills. Hyujin and Jiheng were aghast and opened their mouths blue. Did he just knock out Goose Kim? Dion covered her mouth with her hand and Hyujin was horrified. She was startled but kept looking at Eugene. She didn't understand how it was that he'd managed to knock out his brother before by making quick work of his minions. At the same moment, Ijin moved towards the two bitches. She was mutely terrified and didn't know what to do or where to go. Ijin walked up to them and watched with his black eyes. He clenched his fist ready to teach the creature a lesson. Hyujin was scared. He won't hit me too, will he? At that moment, Dion grabbed Ijin's arm and asked him to stop. He looked at her. But they've been bullying you all this time. Dion didn't know what to say to this clear fact. Isn't that what she did to you today? He asked his sister. Ijin held his hand and remained silent, not knowing what to say. It was just like that. The thing had beaten her without thinking of the consequences. And she wondered, how did he know, as if he hadn't had enough of her appearance. Suddenly it hit her. Is he fighting for me again? She looked into her brother's eyes, still holding his hand. She smiled as sweetly as she could. But I'm fine now, I really am. By that, please stop, she asked her brother. Eugene turned away and agreed. Then I'll walk you to your class, said Ijin to his sister, smiling gently. He walked out of the classroom and she stomped after him in embarrassment while everyone else watched in silence. Everyone in the classroom and in the hallway going, "Oh, my God. What the hell just happened? Did the whole Gishu Kim squad just get run over by one guy?" The classroom was filled with conversation. "Wow, this new guy is pretty hardcore, isn't he?" said Jichin. "It's a good thing we didn't try to jump him." Hyujin continued. "To jump him." Hyujin continued. Youngchan sat at his desk in mute shock at what was happening. The ugly blonde was shaking with both fear and anger while her ugly friend was in mute shock, fucking idiot. She looked at her defeated brother and his men. They were all still unconscious on the floor. Dion, still being shocked, said, "You seem to be good at fighting." Aijin hesitantly agreed with that. "I'm sorry." Again, Dion was embarrassed. Aijin asked in surprise what she was apologizing for. "Because I got you into this story. Yesterday you had to fight because of me. And today it happened again." The girl just couldn't stop blaming herself. Aijin smiled gently and calmly told her not to apologize or blame herself. He did what was tedious. Dion looked at her brother in surprise in response to his caring words. She watched him from the sidelines and was happy. Aijin remembered that the place he had lived in for 10 years was cruel and everyone only pursued their own interests and told his sister. They never cared what happens to others. Until they had to suffer. Aijin continued. "But even these people sometimes behave differently, and only when it's their own families they're talking about," the brother said thoughtfully to his sister. "Their families?" Dion repeated timidly, and a bruise was already visible on her cheek. "Yes," said Aijin, and remembered the bloody battlefields flooring, the noise of machine gun bursts. How the bullet-riddled men fell dead. And how the enemies paid no attention to it moving forward. He remembered the black shadow in the shelter of the trees. Aijin remembered noticing someone in the bushes. "It always made me wonder. I remember walking out to this man pointing a gun and the man spread his arms out to the side. What is family? The bandit he spotted covering his frightened child. Why is this so important?" "But you don't remember me and Grandpa," Dion said timidly. "It's true, I really don't remember much from my childhood," replied Egan honestly. "But that doesn't change the fact that we're family," smiled Egan sincerely, looking at his sister. Dion was embarrassed at such nice words from her brother. They stopped suddenly in the crowded hallway of the school. Dion noticed the way everyone was looking at them. "I'm fine now, so it's time for you to get back to your classes." Embarrassed, Dion waved her hands in front of her brother's face. "But I was going to walk you to class," replied Aijin confusedly. Dion said he'd already seen her off. And pointed to her class sign. She smiled sweetly, "See you later," and waved to her brother. She immediately closed the door to the classroom behind her and Aijin stood and watched. He smiled at the fact that his sister was okay and that he was able to protect her. He was walking down the hallway toward his classroom. Students in the hallway were whispering, "He's back." Aijin walked silently into the classroom and everyone tried to keep quiet. "Dude, you beat those bastards with such power. What did they teach you in school overseas?" "Yeah, man, you beat those bastards." Watching Gisu run was priceless. Jiheng and Hyujin were talking excitedly at each other. "You're really cool," they continued to marvel while Aijin calmly sat back down at his seat sighing. Youngchan looked at Eugene uncertainly. "To be honest?" The kid started uncertainly and Egan looked at him. "I think you're pretty cool too," he said blushing. Aijin smiled silently looking at the kid. And here's Goose Kim banging on the table. His gang sits before him blue with shame and fear. There's something different about that bitch. He doesn't fight like all the typical gangsters at school. Thought Gusu, and his hands were shaking. You'll just sit there like you did before. He just caught you in the act, but you can get the advantage next time, Hyujin said as if she were not afraid of being beaten for all her sins. All the gang quietly bowed their heads. They did not want a repeat of this massacre. He's just one idiot. Are you seriously going to let one man defeat you the way he did? Howled Hyujin, wanting payback. Gusu lost his temper and started yelling, "Piss off and go fight him yourself if you think it's that easy." He was angry at his sister and at himself. They are weak. She looked at him, "I'm sorry, but just don't get offended because you got your ass kicked by some freak." Gusu got even angrier, "What did you just say?" Hyujin was very frightened by this look from her brother and tears came to her eyes. She turned around and started walking away from the room, closing the door behind him very loudly. They never really got on with each other. Hyujin walked down the hallway incredibly angry and her grief-stricken friend ran after her. Damn losers, they couldn't handle just one person, thought Hu-jin. She was angry at her brother and his gang because now everything had changed. She remembered how Egan and Dion walked together to her class. And really fiddled with holding back tears. She walked into the classroom and the girls there visibly tensed up. Hu-jin coldly looked at Dion, who was sitting in her seat with a bruise on her cheek. Well, I guess you're lucky, Dion, Hu-jin said, trying to keep her emotions in check. Dion just remained silent without even looking at Hu-jin. Now you can go to school without worry, you can just run to your older brother if anything happens. Isn't that right? The envious Hu-jin couldn't stop being jealous. Dion still continued to ignore this annoying person. Hu-jin started to shake with anger. That bitch got me. The other girls in the class were very worried. Hu-jin remembered Ijin's cold stare and willingness to beat her up for her sister. So what, now I'm just supposed to let her do whatever she wants? Dion boiled with anger so that even the boys in the class tensed up. Like hell I'll do it, she continued. Hu-jin staring at Dion's back. I think that bitch was up to something again. You could have just left the girl alone. The setting sun colored the sky purple. Classes ended and the students began to leave the school. Dion also slowly walked along with everyone else. The bruise on her cheek seemed to be coming off successfully. She was thinking very hard about something. She remembered her brother beating everyone up and telling her that they were the ones who should be sorry, not her. She remembered the look on his face as he stood beating those three and targeting Hu-jin. And then he smiled genuinely as he walked us to class. We're a family. Does this mean I don't have to worry about school? Thought the girl moving toward the exit. She remembered how Hu-jin had bullied her along with her two girlfriends. She remembered how they made her buy them food and carry it from the canteen. How she beat her in the locker room. What did you just say to me? Don't you fucking talk back to me. Dion remembered Hu-jin holding her by the hair and yelling at her for wanting to talk back. Does that mean they won't hurt me anymore? Dion was thinking so hard that she walked past her brother. What are you thinking about, Dion? He said it so she could hear. Dion snapped out of her memories and looked back at her brother fearfully. He looked at her with a casual smile and said he'd called her name several times already. I'm sorry. I didn't hear you. Have you been waiting for me again? Awkwardly the girl began to babble. Ijin smiled sweetly. Yeah, because I don't know the way home. Dion was surprised he still didn't remember her. Ijin asked if they needed to buy anything and Dion said they needed to go to the store for groceries. Grandpa is very hungry when he comes home late. He's very happy when I make dinner for him, Dion said cheerfully, calming down. They went about their business leisurely, and Hui-jin and her curly-haired friend watched them. Just look at that bitch's smug smile, she told her friend who no longer shared her desire to bully Dion. Hu-jin smiled nastily. Let's see how long that smile lasts. She didn't even think about keeping up with this girl. Meanwhile, the brother and sister are already at the store. Dion picks out the greens. She tried very hard to choose good products and was all in thought. Ijin stood patiently beside her with a cart and many people squinted at them as they passed by. The girls were quietly discussing which school this guy was from and how handsome he was. Dion looked at her brother standing next to her. She thought about the fact that she knew he would be popular at school. On seems outside of school he is just as distinguished because of his beauty. And she suddenly said, Ijin, did you have a girlfriend back home? Ijin was very surprised at such a question. Girlfriend? He asked confused, a girl who is not a friend but a girl? No, it wasn't, Eugene replied briefly, staring into the void. Why not? I can see that you are very popular with the girls. Dion said with a smile. Ijin silently stared at the floor with no emotion on his face. And replied that he was very busy smiling as good-naturedly as possible. What was I even thinking? He was busy trying to adjust to an unfamiliar country. Asked Dion angrily to herself. Did you have a boyfriend you dated? Asked Egan and my sister got nervous. No, shouted Dion in a half voice. Why not? Asked Ejin. Dion was silent thinking what to answer. And replied that she was busy smiling sweetly at her brother too. Evening came and they were home. Grandpa put the box with the phone on the table and said it was for Ijinu. Ijin was very surprised at such an expensive gift. All the kids have them now. I don't know if you'll like it, but they say it's a good phone. Grandpa said with a smile. Dion mentally noted that it was the latest model. Ijin unwrapped the phone and held it gently with both hands, still marveling at the gift. Grandpa smiling sweetly said he had already saved Dion's number and his own in this phone. Dion was surprised and asked if he had done it, because she always helped him with such things. And Grandpa awkwardly said that the salesman had helped him do it. Dion was glad Grandpa had gotten through this and smiled gently at him. Grandpa was embarrassed and said he wanted to do it for Ijin himself, so he asked the salesman to only help, not do it all for him. Dion was surprised by her grandfather's behavior. Ijin looked at his grandfather confusedly. I hear it's important for young people to discover new things nowadays. I hope you don't mind that I opened the drawer to save our phone numbers. Worried Grandpa. Ijin looked at him and smiled, it's okay Grandpa. And then the grandfather got upset that he couldn't buy the same new phone, and the girl tried to calm him down by saying that her phone was still perfectly fine. Ijin watched them both blushed. And smiled very sweetly and warmly, thank you, I really like it. Grandpa was happy that his grandson liked his gift. Ijin kept the box. He lay in bed and held the phone with both hands, customizing everything to his liking. He stared at the screen with all his eyes. Ijin was happy to have his first phone, which was also given to him by his grandfather. Something glowed in the darkness in the major's office. Kong was still busy with work and was surprised that someone texted him so late. It was a message from Ijin. He had asked Kong to contact him at this number. Kong was surprised that Ijin had a new number now. Kim asked Kong, didn't you buy Ijin a cell phone, sir? Kong said he did, and Kim assumed that Ijin had just decided to change it since kids can be very picky. Kong even got a little angry. I bought him the most expensive one of the I was offered, and Kim just said that people can be picky about the brand of phone. A new day has dawned. Ijin was taking his morning shower. As soon as he stepped out of the shower, Dion ran past, see you later. Ijin was surprised she was leaving so early, and Dion said she was already late. Closing the door, she shouted, leave the dishes in the sink after you eat breakfast. Eugene looked at the table, and there was once again a fine and hearty breakfast waiting for him there. Dion was in a big hurry to get to school. She looked at the time and thought she might make it in time. It took longer than I expected to make the soup, but I'm glad Grandpa liked it so much. Dion thought as she ran. She remembered how her grandfather had sympathized with Dion waking up so early in the morning to make soup for breakfast, and how he had said he shouldn't have lost sleep over it, but he had been so happy. Remembering that, Dion smiled. She was glad to be able to do something nice for Grandpa. At that moment, someone kicked Dion with their foot and she fell down. 3 masked men stood in front of her. You better watch where you're going, bitch. You almost broke my ankle, a woman's voice said. Dion was very frightened and looked at these people. And that you're not going to apologize, barked the masked girl. Dion was startled, bowed her head and said, I'm sorry. The girl slapped Dion's face and told her to apologize like it was the last time. Dion covered her face with her hand and was horrified by the recurring pain. Hey, why don't we blow off some steam at karaoke? Said a girl who looked like Hoojin. And the one who was beating Dion and the other one also agreed that it would be a great idea. A girl with white hair sat down beside Dion. You're coming with us, Dion, she said, looking into the girl's eyes. And Dayan recognized that voice, it's Hoojin Kim. And here they are at the karaoke bar. They were discussing who was going to sing, and past the front desk the employee only said, come see us again. The worker sighed and was about to go into the room to clean up. He thought about why they were yelling so much when they sang, must be good lungs since they're so loud. He opened the door. And froze in horror. There was a beaten schoolgirl lying on the floor. It was Dion. The employee was at a loss to ask what was wrong with her and if she was okay. Dion struggled to get up from the floor. She said she was fine and gathered her things on the floor, and the employee realized that she was most definitely not fine. He asked her to wait while he called an ambulance, but Dion refused. She came out of the room covered in blood and said she was fine. The employee was terrified. She was barely walking against the wall, and the employee yelled, hey, wait. The class teacher asked the students at roll call, has anyone seen Dion? A girl from class said she wasn't in today. It was strange because she'd never done this before. Hoojin quietly exulted in her small victory. The curly-haired girlfriend asked Hoojin if everything was going to be alright, and Hoojin, smiling, why would anything not be alright? We just charged that shit a little, complimented mentally. Her friend was worried, and Hoojin said that Dion missing school had nothing to do with them. And the girl got all excited, yeah sure, it's none of our business. And Hoojin grinned nastily. It was already evening and classes were over. Ijin stood at the exit. But he didn't see his sister in the crowd of students. But he stood and gazed into each one. Almost everyone is out of the school grounds by now. And the beginning of darkness, but he waited. He waited for her and wondered what could have happened. Maybe she's already gone home, he thought, and decided to call her. Dion was indeed at home. She was lying in her room, unresponsive to her brother's calls. He called her for a very long time. But she lay under the blanket without the slightest reaction. Ejin came home. He looked at the floor. Her "she's home" shoes were neatly placed there. Ijin started to take off his backpack, still wondering what had happened. He decided to go to his sister's room. Ijin knocked lightly on the door and called out to Dion. But there was silence in response. But a second later, Dion said in a low, weak voice, "Oh, you're home now, Ejin." Ejin decided to ask how she was, but Dion continued, "Oh, you must have been waiting for me." Her brother said he called her 3 times and Dion apologized and said she was asleep. Eugene realized something was wrong in her voice. He asked him to let him in just for a second, but his sister refused, saying she was in bed because she wasn't feeling well. Ijin got worried and asked if she was sick a lot, and Dion said she would be fine once she got some sleep. He asked his sister to tell him if she needed anything and Dion said she would. Ejin decided to go to the pharmacy and buy her some medicine. Just as suddenly he stopped and shuddered. There was blood on the sister's shoes. He immediately changed his face and realized what had really happened. He was already looking with glassy and angry eyes. There was blood on his sister's shoes. That meant she'd been beaten again. He was ready to kill again. The sun was already setting in the courtyard. Ejin brought the first aid kit. Ijin was treating his sister's wounds. "Is it really bad?" "My sister said it's the medication that's making the wound sore," and my brother said, "Be careful, please. You fell down the stairs trying to dodge the velocipede," Ijin asked again. Dion awkwardly said that it was. "It looks just as bad as if you had run into by a man on a bicycle." Ijin continued and Dion laughed nervously. Eugene looked at his sister seriously and asked if she was sure she didn't need a doctor's help. Dion looked down, frightened and trembled. She clutched at the blanket and said she was fine. The girl realized that if they went to the hospital, her brother would know that the bruises were not from falling down the stairs. Principal's office. There was a disgruntled Eugene asking why she was in trouble and why she was being asked how Dion got hurt. Dion looked at Eugene and held back her emotions as best she could. Dion said, "Because you did it, there were police in the principal's office," and Eugene just denied it. "No, I didn't. You covered your face with a hat and a mask, but I know it was you. I heard your voice and the way you were talking to me. It was in the same majir," shouted Dion. "You were always bullying me at school," the girl continued, and Eugene nervously fixed her hair. "You just assume it was me even though you didn't see my face? Just because we stand not being friends," continued Eugene, and Dion fell silent. Dion was asked if she saw the face of the man who attacked her. Dion tried to explain to the police that the attacker's face was covered, but there was definitely Eugene. Eugene's mother was as nasty as her daughter. "What is the point of this spectacle? You call the police and treat my daughter like a criminal. And all because of some ridiculous hunch." The woman screamed at the top of her voice. The principal asked her to calm down, but she kept yelling, "No, I'm not gonna calm down." There's no doubt it was Eugene. The battered girl thought in confusion. "But why doesn't anyone believe me?" She looked at the police, who lowered their eyes because of Eugene's mother's screams. "Apologize to my daughter immediately. Who taught you to pull such evil tricks?" the woman shouted, pointing at Dion. "But it was really Eugene," the girl shouted back, unable to contain herself. The woman continued to yell about Dion's bad manners and what she would say to her parents. "Bring your parents here." There was a muffled shout to the confused girl. Dion stood there, unable to answer anything. Terror gripped her and she began bitterly to cry. She saw Eugene's evil grin and her angry mother. "Same situation again, since I don't have any proof, and I don't want it to bother Grandpa." It was Dion's memories from the past. Suddenly she heard her name. It was her brother who touched her. Dion shyly replied, "Yes, I'm fine." Dion replied timidly, "Yeah, I'm fine." "Well, at least the bones don't seem to be broken. But the bruises are pretty bad and will hurt for a few days," Ijin said, looking at his sister. Dion bowed her head. "Okay." She tried not to look her brother in the eye. "Geez, you're really good at this." Visibly jealous, Dion said with a smile. "Isn't it too tight?" asked Eugene, turning away to the first aid kit. Dion said it was fine. Dion was also worried that Grandpa wouldn't get nervous because he has a weak heart. Ejin worriedly asked if Grandpa was doing anything for his health, and Dion told his brother that Grandpa drinks pills every day. Ijin gathered the first aid kit and said he'd make sure Grandpa didn't worry and his sister could sleep. Dion thanked her brother. Ejin was walking toward the door. His sister suddenly called his name and he stopped. She smiled as best she could and thanked her brother for taking care of her. Ijin turned around and smiled gently at his sister. Dion reassured herself that she had done the right thing by not saying anything to her brother. She thought about how a couple of teenagers like her and her brother couldn't change anything about the situation. Ejin came out of her room and stopped. He blazed with cold rage and a desire to kill anyone who had caused his sister harm and pain. Wolf Nightclub. Loud music and purple neon stood out against the quiet nighttime city. All school talks about yesterday, someone said angrily. Gusu and his gang were sitting in the club. All were beaten and bruised. How could the scale guys beat all of you, including you, Gusu? A disgruntled voice kept shouting. Gusu and his gang just sat silently drinking in response. The drunk kid asks Goose about his next move. Our problem was that we underestimated him. But now we can do it if we plan ahead. The second one also began to knit that they couldn't just let him exist like that. The third started saying he wouldn't stand a chance against them all. Gushu realized that Ijin wasn't an easy target at all, but they really couldn't just walk all over him. Gusi put the glass on the table grunting, "Fuck yeah, we'll destroy it." Going one-on-one wasn't their style and they decided to attack all at once and were awfully early for it. Everyone smiled bloody smiles and waited to beat one guy all at once. They planned to attack him tomorrow with everything they had. Suddenly Goose got a call from his sister. He smoked and picked up the phone and she asked her brother if he was at the bar with his idiots right now. He told her to say what she wanted or he'd hang up and he heard, you owe me big time." Gushu still didn't understand what this was about. His sister told him she beat up Dion today and she didn't come to school. "We have to make sure no one thinks she had anything to do with it." Gusu was shocked at his stupid sister's output and laughed. But he was glad since they were going to teach Eugene a lesson anyway. At that moment, someone else entered the club. This someone headed straight for the room where Gusu and his gang were sitting. Goose and one other noticed that it was Ijin. Ijin walked calmly in their direction without hiding his presence. His eyes were cold. That was something to be afraid of. Gusu came out from behind himself. "Who does he think he is entering our territory?" His sister got excited. "Gushu. What are you talking about in there?" She yelled into the phone while her brother and his gang were beaming in shock at the appearance of Ijin and how he just walked to their table. He looked straight into the asshole's eyes. Goose, not realizing his own wretchedness, said that he was looking forward to a rematch. Ijin had already taken over his gang and was tearing the first one apart again with a single punch to the face. He grabbed him by the skull with a hard squeeze. Holding him by the head, he slammed him to the floor with all his strength so that his head crunched. He was immediately attacked by a second kid with confidence. Ijin met him with a great punch to the jaw so that his attacker's eyes lit up. Gusu was still sitting at the table with the others, but they seemed to be getting a little bit of a kick out of it and were getting ready to attack. Gusu and two of the boys had overturned the table they were sitting at in a fit of anger and were determined to break Ijin. They all rushed toward him at once. And Ijin just stood there waiting for them to get closer. They ran in his direction. The first one, who hadn't fought him before, was met with a straight leg kick. The kid rolled backwards from that blow. And the bully, who'd already been beaten twice by Eugene, saw it, but kept fighting. How stupid. Ijin grabbed the man he had just kicked by the scruff of his neck. And dragged sharply in the other direction. He threw the kid into the wall so that he quacked from the impact. Ejin was already running at the guy to add a fist. A curly-haired asshole jumped on him. Who promptly got punched in the face for rolling his eyes. The other kid was getting ready to hit Eugene over the head with a bottle and jumped up just in time for the blow. Ejin noticed him. And in the same instant she was beside him. He quickly knocked the man out with one punch. That fat, curly-haired kid was running at him again. Ejin dodged his stupid punch. Then he grabbed his arm, which surprised the asshole. Ijin gave the big man a good fist to the temple and he passed out. And fell on the floor with the rest of the guys who had been so despondent up to that point. Ejin grabbed the kid that wanted to earlier hit him with a bottle by the hair. And mercilessly slammed his face into his knee so hard it crunched. He tossed the kid aside and blood streamed from his face. And again he stood among the pile of bodies, and on his feet stood only Goose, who was again frightened. Gusu watched Eugene's atrocities. How can he not realize that calm people are better off not being pushed around? On the other side of the phone was still his sister, who didn't understand a damn thing and was waiting for an explanation from her brother. But Gushu looked at Aijin and wondered where he came from with such skills. "Goosey Kim," said Jean loudly, and the kid jumped up. "I really have to explain things to you now," with anger in his words and look, continued Eugene, looking the freak straight in the eye. "I told you to leave my sister alone," Aijin said through gritted teeth, losing the self-control. Gusu realized that those who most talked about teaching this guy a lesson are already unconscious. He blocked us, knocking out the people outside first. Then he attacked us so that we had to climb over the table. Gusu tried to analyze Eugene's actions. It only took him a few seconds to figure out the structure of the rooms. Gusu continued to think frantically, remembering how quickly and deftly Aijin had scattered everyone. And he realized that he could not be defeated, even by a full squad. Aijin interrupted the bastard's musings. "What did my sister do to you?" Gusu smiled nervously and asked Aijin to calm down and pretend he didn't know what he was talking about. Then he threw the glass at Eugene, but missed. Aijin had expected this action from such an idiot. He just stared silently into his eyes. And Gusu thought it would be a good idea to attack Eugene with a bottle. He missed on his first attempt. Then he tried to strike again, but also failed to even touch Aijin. Aijin then began to successfully block weak and haphazard punches from Gusu. Gushu wrinkled his nose in pain. And he was even angrier, which made it hard for him to make sense of the situation he was in. Aijin just beat him up without too many words or movements. It was absolutely as simple as breathing. Gusu even lost the ability to see for a second. And I started staring backwards, trying not to fall. He stepped away from Aijin, but there was already a wall behind him. Gusu's legs were shaking and he could hardly breathe. Damn it, the jerk's nose was broken again and bleeding. He looked at Eugene with hatred and breathed heavily. Aijin wasn't even out of breath and just stood there watching Gusu's exertions. "Did you really want to bully an ordinary cashless girl like that?" Eugene asked. Goose broke the bottle, making a rose. The shards glittered on the floor. "Just die, you freak," shouted Goosey at Aijin with a broken bottle. Aijin stared into the stupid freak's eyes and said nothing. A lightning strike knocked the bottle out of Goose's hand. Aijin grabbed the brat by the throat and lifted him up with one hand. Gushu wheezed due to the strength of Aijin's grip and the pain. His feet came off the floor a few centimeters. Aijin slammed Goose's back and head against the wall with all his strength and anger. The goose even had tears from the pain that pierced his entire body. Aijin then flopped the freak to the floor and continued to apply pressure to his throat. Gushu was grabbing at Aijin's clothes in a panic and couldn't breathe. His head was rasping with pain. "Gushu Kim," once again Eugene addressed him. "What am I going to do with you?" Coldly and with mortal danger in his mind, Aijin asked him. Gushu looked at Aijin covered in blood and couldn't speak out of pain and fear. "This is your last warning," said Aijin. "I'll be back if I ever hear a single rumor that you went near my sister. And you better not let your sister anywhere near mine." Aijin continued to say, still hurting the freak. "Because if she so much as laid a finger on my sister, I'll come back for you." Aijin spoke, leaning closer and closer over Goose's frightened face. "And you won't want to see me more," added Aijin, pressing his elbow harder on Goose's throat, who began to wheeze. The thought that he couldn't breathe pierced Goose's consciousness and his eyes went black. Aijin quietly stifled the soul of the freak whose family caused his sister to suffer so much. Aijin said that next time he wouldn't hold back, coldly staring straight into the asshole's soul. Gusu was already turning blue and foamy drool was pouring from his mouth. Aijin at this point decided to stop pressing down on the poor man's throat. Gusu began frantically grabbing at his throat and trying to breathe. Aijin began to move towards the exit while Gushu curled into a fetal position on the club table and tried to take a breath. Aijin calmly walked past the employees of the establishment, who were horrified. Someone even tried to call somewhere to solve the problem. And so the girls run toward the club. Jean didn't understand what was going on at the club and decided to go there with her girlfriend. She had a bad rep. And for good reason. She and her girlfriend stopped at the very entrance to the bar. They heard someone's slow footsteps. And they saw Aijin coming out. Jean looked at him fearfully and began to tremble. She didn't know what to do because Eugene was already right next to her and he was mad as hell. "Wait. He can't prove that I beat Daejin," Jean thought fearfully and shouted at Aijin not to come any closer. He stopped and stared at the stuff. She was afraid of him and angry because he took Dion and not her. That's how jealous she was. Jean started to stare back and stared at the wall. She slipped and fell. What a poor thing, fell right on its ugly ass. She grimaced in pain as she hit her elbow as well. Aijin was still standing still and didn't even look at the blonde self-righteous cunt. Aijin got a call from his grandfather and picked up the phone. Igrampa, kalmli raplia. The guy from the man. These two girls were very surprised. Sure, I'm on my way, he said to his grandfather, turning toward Hoojin. She was still sitting on her ass and was very frightened by his cold and cruel stare. He just turned around and walked away, leaving those two alone with their consciences. Hoojin gulped nervously and stared. In the wake of your problem. When she walked into the bar, she saw her brother's friends on the floor unconscious and him sitting at a table with his head hanging down powerlessly. She asked him what happened. Did that bastard fuck you again? Screamed the fool. Gusu told her to shut up. Hoojin told her to leave her sister, Aijin. And Hoojin could not believe his words. She pretended she didn't know what she was talking about. Goose yelled, I said leave her alone, and spat blood. Hoojin was dumb enough to say, are you afraid of him? Gusu told his sister to answer him and Hoojin started making excuses again. Hushu interrupted her with a shout of Hoojin. He raised his eyes to her and pounded his fists on his knees. Hoojin was frightened either by the mess instead of her brother's face or by his scream. He looked at his sister and said, I'll say this once, if you ever come near his sister again I will beat you up myself. Did you hear me? He bellowed at her. She stood there, blue with anger and fear, silent. Once again a quiet night lit by excellent lanterns. Ejin was walking home and saw someone's shadow. It was his grandfather who came out to meet him. He was waiting for him by the lantern. They sat down on a bench and Grandpa apologized for tearing him away from his friends and Eugene said it was okay. Grandpa was upset that Dion was so badly injured. She said you treated her wounds, said Grandpa. Egan said that was exactly what happened. She said she fell down the stairs, but I don't think that's true. It looks pretty serious, but she refuses to go to the hospital. Worried Grandpa. Grandpa said he tried his best to raise Dion by himself. He had no idea how to raise the girl and spent all his time trying to earn money. Grandpa regretted that he couldn't give her what she needed. And he was very happy that she was doing so well. Looking back over all those years, she gave me so much more than anything I could have given her. Grandpa smiled sadly. I lost everything in that accident. And only Dayan helped me survive. Grandpa remembered how he had to bury his family because he couldn't see the body. And now it breaks my heart to see her in so much pain, and she won't even tell me the real reason for it. Through Grandpa's words, you could hear how much pain he was in. Grandpa thought she didn't say anything because she thought he was too old to understand. They say that as children get older, they become more distant from their parents. It must be even worse than going to an elderly grandfather, said Grandpa sadly. Suddenly he was interrupted by Aijin. Grandpa. I haven't been here very long. But some points are obvious from the start. You're very fond of Dion. Aijin continued to tell his grandfather. But sometimes. Paused Eugene. You just don't see how much she loves you. From these words of Aijin's grandfather was very surprised. He looked at his grandson barely holding back tears. And Aijin looked at him smiling gently. Aijin smiled even more and asked his grandfather not to worry so much since he would be watching her at school now. Grandpa was happy. Grandpa didn't know how to put into words what he was feeling right now. And he said he was very glad he was here with them. And they continued to sit on the bench and look at the lights of the city at night.